All right, hello everyone. So this will be the second commentary on my channel. For those of you who don't know, these commentaries are an opportunity for me to sort of have a in-depth discussion about a specific topic, as well as to clarify or correct any mistakes I may have made in my other videos. And I try to do this without a script, as opposed to my usual videos where I script them and read from the script. In this video, in this commentary, I wanted to talk about the topic of whether or not we can trust Carl Jung's ideas. If you've looked at any of the videos on my channel, you might note that I talk about many of Carl Jung's ideas, theories, as well as theories and ideas inspired by Jungian psychology, which begs the question, can we actually trust Jungian psychology and take it as actual fact? Which is a very interesting question because I don't have a sound conclusion. I do want to make the case that we can lend a fair amount of credence to Carl Jung's ideas. Otherwise, I wouldn't be so interested in discussing them. And I also wanted to sort of clarify many of the misconceptions about Carl Jung and about science and psychology in general, so that we could ultimately see that that there is a utility in Jungian psychology, that it is a very useful psychological model. I find it really useful actually for talking about history and mythology. It's one of the better psychologies that accounts for sort of the past psychic activity of human beings, the historical products of our minds. Art, for instance, in general, I think is well explained with the Jungian model. And so there is a lot of value in Jung's theories, but we do have to wonder whether or not his ideas are accurate. And a lot of the reason people may... So Jung today isn't as well studied as he used to be. And many of his ideas have pretty much been discarded. And I think the reason for this, one of the reasons for this, is that the language that Jung used makes his ideas sound very mystical and very metaphysical and very magical. When you actually understand the theories and what he's trying to get at, you realize that he's just kind of trying to find a good way to explain some rather peculiar phenomena of the human mind. But there are genuine criticisms of Jung that we should address and sort of should try to rectify. Again, a big criticism levied against Jung, which again is perfectly legit, is the fact that Jung didn't use science when he came up with his theories. And this stems from a couple of things. So early in the history of psychology, psychology and philosophy were pretty bound up together, almost like the same discipline, until psychology started to branch off and become its own thing. But originally, psychology was just a philosophy of mind, and philosophy isn't necessarily a science. It's just more of a dialectic, attempting to understand truth, but not using a quantitative method or an experimental method to determine that truth, or to derive insights, or to derive values. The word philosophy denotes quite a range of different subjects. Some of the earlier psychologists who are more prominent, like William James, his psychology is more or less just him attempting to explain his observations of the human mind, specifically his own mind, and build a model of his mind, as well as to try and generalize that to other people. So Jung and his contemporaries, his famous contemporaries, which include Sigmund Freud and Alfred Adler, so I want to make it clear that when they were sort of developing their theories, there wasn't necessarily a scientific approach to doing so. There was an empirical approach. There was an empirical approach The word empirical means pretty much from observation. So they derived their ideas from observations. They didn't just make them up on the spot. And what I mean by that there was no science applied to it is the fact that there was no experimental method. That's debatable because if you look at some of Jung's earlier works, you'll note that there is like a quantitative attempt to sort of make observations, but it's not as rigorous as today's standards, and even then the standards of the day when Jung was developing his ideas. So Jung, Freud, and Adler. Again, Sigmund Freud as well. Is this criticism applies to him as well, where there was no sort of science in his ideas. He just sort of came up with them and then attempted to explain his observations on the basis of his theories. But Freud and Jung and Alfred Adler, who I want to talk about more in the future because he's very interesting and his psychology is very very useful. But each of those men thought that their methods were very scientific, that they were being perfectly rational, where they would develop a theory and then compare that theory to observation to see whether their theories fit the observations, and they would call that the scientific process. But science is much more rigorous than that. So we have to define what we mean by science, because a lot of people use the word science and actually don't necessarily know what it means or what it covers, and just assume that certain forms of thinking are inherently more scientific than others. But science does have a very specific definition, which is science is, again, not an ideology; it's a process. The process of science is a process of determining truth through experiment. And an experiment is an attempt to isolate a variable to see whether that isolated variable has an impact upon the situation, so that we could say that the variable, whatever it is, causes a certain situation. For example, you can compare males and females. Which of the two sexes is more, more aggressive? And so the variables are male or female, and then you attempt to see whether your hypothesis, which might be females are more aggressive or males are more aggressive, and using a quantitative method to determine whether that's a generalizable statement. And that's an experiment, because you're attempting to sort of isolate. You're trying to see whether maleness or femaleness is the cause of the observation, which is aggressiveness. And that's the scientific method, and that's by far the best way to determine truth. By far, we know that because I make that claim because sort of ever since the scientific revolution, humans have been going on this crazy evolutionary tangent where we've developed the most sophisticated technology that we've ever seen, and it doesn't seem like we're stopping anytime soon. And all of this is thanks to science, thanks to the experimental approach of science. So if we value science this much and we know that it is the best way to determine truth, why should we trust the theories and ideas of somebody who definitely did not use science to study his field? Okay, so there's two things I want to get at here. The first thing is how Carl Jung came up with his ideas, getting more specific into how he studied the psyche. And I want to talk about psychology and science, and why psychology is very difficult to study. I guess I'll start with the latter point, which is the fact that psychology is not like the other sciences. Its subject matter is something very, very difficult to observe. You can observe your own psyche, obviously. You can experience your own mind and sort of note your mind's tendencies, note your own behaviors, note how your consciousness operates, make notes about your own mind. That's all well and done, but how do you prove that somebody else has consciousness? Nobody has been able to prove that another individual has their own consciousness, has their own subjective point of view. It's just something we sort of take as a fact because it's pretty much impossible to prove. And that's the problem with psychology. Psychology is the study of the human psyche, very literally the study of the human psyche. And there are offshoots of psychology, such as behaviorism, which pretty much study human behavior as though there were no psyche. which annoyed people. Behaviorism is like a big point of contention with a lot of psychologists. I personally don't have that negative an opinion of it. But the flaw with the method of behaviorism is it ignores the fact that humans have a subjective experience. And you may be thinking right now, if you're scientifically minded, that a subjective experience isn't really even subject to scientific inquiry anyways, because it's subjective. Science is about the objective, the factual, the observations that we all agree upon, rather than the subjective point of view. And so you might think that psychology is just not scientific at all. And the thing is here is that we have to. So one of the videos I want to refer you to on my channel is the one called Carl Jung, Metaphysics of the Psyche, because if you can understand what he's trying to say or what Jung's point is in that video, then you'll really understand his philosophy and sort of why, or sort of understanding his sort of point of view about psychology, about the human psyche. And to sum it up, the psyche is real. It's something that's definitely occurring. You are definitely conscious, and you have an unconscious mind, and your mind is definitely having a subjective experience. And we could reduce this to physical occurrences in the brain, but even regardless of whether there are physical occurrences in the brain, whether there are physical neurons firing, chemical action, all that good stuff happening in your brain, that translates to a subjective experience. And psychology is ostensibly, some psychologies don't actually study the human psyche, which Jung was annoyed about, but it should be the study of the human psyche, the study of that subjective experience, that field of view that we all have. It's the study of what of that experience, and that's something that's very difficult to study, but it's definitely worth studying. It's definitely worth trying to gain insights about the psyche. And even Jung himself warned that our lack of psychology was a significant threat to our stability. Our lack of understanding of the human psyche and widespread knowledge of it was a big risk for society, because he delivers this warning in multiple books. Excuse me. For example, in The Undiscovered Self, he pretty much raises the point that ideological differences are one thing, but fundamentally what causes conflict is a psychological problem, is a root at the level of human psychology. And so understanding psychology would be very useful for preventing conflicts. But of course, our understanding of psychology is quite limited, both in the present and historically. But Jung believed that an understanding of psychology was vital for if humans wanted to keep sort of evolving and keep progress going. So how did Jung study the psyche? Well, he was, again, this is not a scientific approach, but it's still a very, very useful approach. And I'll contrast this with the scientific approach, which I'll describe in a second. But let's examine how Jung would have derived his insights. The first way he did it was to examine his own mind. He would deeply ponder the sort of habits and activities of his own mind. He was very introspective, and he very introverted. So he would just simply sit there and let his mind work, let his mind produce fantasies spontaneously, examine them very rigorously. He would examine his own dreams a lot, and then he would gain a very vast knowledge of his own psyche, from which he would develop his theories. And then the second way was that from his patients, he would gather a huge amount of information, a very, very intense study of individual cases. And now this sort of contrasts with science, where science is attempting to be generalizable, and so it's not worth the sort of scientific attitude to study an individual case so closely. But again, since we're dealing with the field of psychology, which is so nebulous, so closed off from understanding, the scientific approach may not be the best way to approach psychology. Jung's approach may actually be a significantly better way to gain understanding of the human psyche. And so he would gather the dreams of his patients, hundreds of dreams. Some patients he collected hundreds of different dreams and studied them very, very intensely to note the patterns that occurred between them. And he did this for a lot of his patients and compared the evidence between patients to see sort of the differences and the similarities. And that's where he developed his ideas. It's from a very, very intense study of individual psychic material. Psychic material, what I mean by that is simply dreams, anything produced by the psyche. He would even have his patients paint. Many of his patients objected, saying, that they weren't painters. But Jung pretty much just pointed out that anything you paint is essentially representative of your unconscious mind, and so we can gain an understanding of your mind just through the art that this person produced. And so he got this huge amount of psychic material, and that's how he was able to sort of theorize and develop an extensive knowledge of the human psyche. He wrote so many books. I don't even know how many, but his collected works have 15 volumes, 15 or 16. I'm not 100% sure about that. And each of them contain several books, all about the human mind, all about his theories. And so that's how he was able to develop a comprehensive knowledge of the psyche. It's much more comprehensive than I would say most psychological scientists have, just because it was such an intense study of his own mind and of the minds of his patients. The modern psychological or modern scientific attitude would be sort of abhorred by that kind of approach, because obviously you don't study your own subjective point of view, because that's just your subjective point of view. It's just your opinion, more or less. But the thing is, you have to remember is that a person's opinions are the result of psychological processes in their brains and are still therefore very valuable information for studying the psyche. So let's contrast this with the modern scientific approach. And now again, I don't want to bash on science at all. Like I've said before, science is by far the best way to gain insights that are definitely true. The problem is that in a field like psychology, we need a more rigorous approach, and science may not be the best approach for gaining information in psychology. And there are a lot of problems with modern scientific psychology. Of course, psychology today is there's still a lot of useful information being gathered, but it's difficult to say how generalizable it is. So some problems with modern psychology is that the experiments that take place are usually very limited, usually only a few people. They usually only observe one phenomenon, and then sort of that's where they sort of try to apply statistics to see if it's generalizable, to see how humans behave. The problem is that, of course, if you only study a few people, if your sample size, for example, if your experiment only involves 50 people, that's a very small percentage of the population, and it's hard to say whether your single observation from that group is applicable to the general populace, especially since many subjects for psychology experiments are like undergraduate students at university, and that's a specific demographic. But this isn't my biggest problem with experimental psychology. My biggest problem with it is that it specifically only tries to measure a single variable when the psyche is influenced by an uncountable number of factors. Your personal experience, there might be something in your past that predisposes you to a certain behavior. And so how do you differentiate between what's the result of individual experience and what's the result of natural human psychology that isn't derived from personal experience? It's very hard to differentiate between those two. And there are other problems as well. For example, I've actually participated in a couple of psychology experiments, and one of the big problems is that when you're being experimented on, you're not going to act in the same way that you would normally or naturally. In a natural setting, you act or behave differently than when you're being watched by an experiment. I found myself, when I was doing these experiments, constantly trying to find what the purpose of the experiment was in order to give them the result they wanted, which is kind of a dumb thing to do. But it's an inevitable consequence of knowing that you're participating in a psychology experiment. You don't act the way you normally would. And so a proper psychology experiment would have participants that don't know they're being studied. But for various reasons, that's unethical. So, that method doesn't usually wash. So what was my train of thought? Yeah, okay, so again, there are problems with scientific psychology, and I think that Jung's method of studying the psyche although non-scientific, is still very, very useful. Because we have to remember about Jung was that he was first and foremost a medical doctor. His priority was the treatment of his patient's psychological condition. And so he needed a methodology that could do that. He wasn't just interested in collecting scientific facts about psychology just for the sake of, having knowledge about the human psyche. He wanted knowledge of the psyche for the purpose of treating people. And so his theoretical framework, collective unconscious, personal unconscious, archetypes, all that stuff, was developed with the patient in mind. Was sort of developed as a way to treating most of the psychological problems that he might encounter. And of course, it's by no means fully comprehensive. Jung himself admitted that his work wasn't complete. In fact, far from it. He basically just scratched the surface of psychology, and there was much more work to be done. But then now we come to the problem of we know how Jung developed his ideas, but how much credence can we lend to that sort of method? I personally think it's very interesting. It's a very it's a lot of information to process, and therefore it's still useful. But is it totally accurate? I'm sorry, I kind of went off topic. But one thing I wanted to also say was that there are definitely good psychological experiments. I actually did have an example of an experiment that was basically not repeatable. Many psychology experiments end up not being repeatable, where by that I mean that they run the experiment again with different people and then get completely different results. And a lot of psychological experiments aren't tested like that. They aren't repeated independently by a different scientist to see if their same results occur. But of course, this isn't science's fault. This isn't the researcher's fault. It's just the fact that psychology is just so hard to study. It's such an impenetrable mist to actually get at the human psyche. But of course, there are good psychological experiments that do definitely confirm specific ideas because they're very rigorous or because they're tested by multiple people, and that's how we can lend more credence to them. Or they use a large sample size so that we know that the results are very generalizable. So there are definitely good psychological experiments. And so this is where I kind of want to get to one of my points, where it's not like an either or situation where we either trust Jung's way of doing it or we trust modern science's way of doing it. It's kind of a balancing act where we know that where a lot of Jung's ideas were very useful, but we also know that a lot of modern psychology is very useful. And it's, like I said before, that process of integrating new information to fit the old framework and sort of editing the old framework to accord with new data. And so, one criticism that Freud and Carl Jung get a lot is that their ideas were unfalsifiable. Now, you might hear this word a lot, unfalsifiable, which basically means that what it technically means is that whatever proposition you've made, whatever hypothesis you've made, it's not actually testable. There's no experiment that you could do to actually prove whether it's right or wrong. Now, I don't believe that many ideas are unfalsifiable. Maybe like moral ideas and ideological ideas and philosophical ideas, you can't prove. There's a lot of philosophical ideas that you can't prove as being right or wrong. It depends what you mean by right or wrong. But many ideas that seem unfalsifiable are actually are falsifiable. It's just that we haven't found the proper approach to doing the experiment. And so this is one thing this is my opinion, that just because something is unfalsifiable doesn't make it synonymous with not true. Unfalsifiable and false are not synonyms. Unfalsifiable just means that the idea, we have to kind of, be more critical of the idea because it's harder to prove, it's harder to know whether it's true or false. And many of Jung's ideas seemed unfalsifiable. His theory of archetypes seemed unfalsifiable. His theory of introversion and extroversion seemed unfalsifiable. But what we later learned is that many scientific experiments, psychological experiments, are more or less in line with Jung's ideas. So it's not like Jung developed his ideas and then science proved them wrong. Science has been proving Jung's ideas mostly correct. There's a couple of examples I can mention. One was his competing idea with Freud, that an infant's sort of attachment to its mother. Freud believed it to be on the basis of libido, but Jung believed it to be archetypal and instinctual and not on the basis of libido. In essence, Freud believed that an infant was attracted to its mother because the mother provided food and sustenance, satisfying its pleasure principle in Freudian terms. But Jung believed that it was more instinctual, more natural, and not just based on the satisfaction of pleasure. And there are experiments that show that that's pretty much the case. Anthony Stevens, who is a Jungian psychoanalyst but also a researcher, did an experiment or made some observations with children I wish I could pull it up. It's a very specific experiment. But his conclusion was ultimately that the Jungian model made more sense. There's also observations about how laboratory monkeys are more likely to cling to a source of warmth, and they're more likely. So imagine a laboratory monkey that's been taken away from its mother, and there are two sort of devices in front of it. One is one that produces milk, and the other is just like a furry toy for it to cling onto, and it'll prefer the toy because it feels more like its mother rather than the milk, even though the milk produces, it's sustaining. And that would indicate more towards Jungian ideas. It's not a confirmation of Jung's ideas. It's more like evidence that suggests that Jung was more right than Freud in this regard. That wasn't a great example, I admit, but a better example is the idea of introversion and extroversion. Introverted and extroverted personality types. A lot of people don't realize or don't know that Jung was the person who originated this idea that people can be introverted or extroverted. Again, when he proposed this idea, it seemed unfalsifiable, but we know today that there are definitely introverted and extroverted personality types. That's a very good distinction between personalities. It's not as comprehensive. So it's not, you can't just say somebody is either introverted or extroverted. It's kind of a spectrum, and it's kind of incomplete. There's more aspects to the personality than introversion and extroversion, but that is one of those dimensions that we do observe, that psychologists observe, and so it seems that Jung's original idea was actually right. But at the time when Jung developed this idea, it seemed unfalsifiable, and it seemed potentially wrong. But later evidence would conclude that it's along the right lines. I wouldn't say it's confirmed, like the theory is fully confirmed, because it's very difficult to confirm anything in psychology. But there is more evidence towards Jung's ideas. So these are some reasons why we can trust Jung's ideas more than. Despite the fact that he didn't use science to develop his ideas. Of course, there are other reasons why Jung's ideas are easily dismissible, and this has to do with the language of his theories. So things like archetypes, it seems like something subjective like that. Something like the theory of archetypes can't be true, and also the word archetype makes it sound very metaphysical. But of course, we have to again realize that Jung was attempting to develop these ideas for the purpose of his medical practice, and so he needed to develop a framework which was useful. And so I think the archetypal theory, the theory of archetypes, is a very useful way to approach human behavior. And so another point I want to get at is somebody could oppose to Jung's idea on the basis of, okay, let's just explain, for example, the mother archetype. So the mother archetype refers to an instinctual predisposition in a person's mind. The word primordial image comes up a lot. in Jung's works. What he means by that is like almost like the child has a template of what its mother should be, so that when it recognizes its mother in reality, it can, form the proper relationship with its mother. That's what he means by an archetype. And you may think like, if you're a materialist and scientifically minded, you may think that doesn't, you don't have to explain the instinctual behavior of a human infant to bond with its mother on the basis of an archetype. You can explain it through, there are certain hormonal developments within the child at that age, and genes and all that. But again, the archetype is a way to explain this phenomenon from the perspective of the psyche. Hormones and nerves and all that, that's all material, and that's not untrue. But what Jung is trying to study is the psyche. How does it feel to the person? And so this archetypal theory very, very much satisfies the subjective sort of quality of the mother archetype rather than its physical concomitants. And again, we're not trying to reduce the physical concomitants to nothing. We're just trying to say that there is a subjective experience regardless of the sort of physical conditions taking place within the body. Other ideas, like if you've studied some of Jung's early works, you may have heard of a concept called psychic energy, which sounds like, when you hear the word psychic energy, the first thing I think is like something like to do with the Matrix. But this concept, so this is something I want to. There's a good video I've made that about the connection between consciousness and language, and how metaphors are sort of the basis of consciousness. And so something like psychic energy sounds magical, sounds metaphysical, but it's actually just a useful metaphor, a useful analogy, an analogy between, the concept of energy and physics, and then applying that idea to the psyche. A brief explanation of the concept of psychic energy is that you can sort of direct your attention. For example, if you try to solve a puzzle, you can direct your attention to it for a certain amount of time before you get exhausted or cognitively exhausted and try to, and then you have to take a break. And that's what he means by psychic energy. You can sort of direct your psyche in certain directions, but only for a limited amount of time before you get exhausted or cognitively stressed. And so another thing with Jung, and another thing with this is like kind of with psychology in general. We get a lot of theories in psychology, and then we kind of adopt the weird viewpoint. Well, it's not weird, I guess, but it's kind of the natural viewpoint where one theory is right and therefore the other theories are wrong. But it's more like each theory kind of has its place, and each theory is attempting to describe the same thing, but in a different way. Like an example, the example I just mentioned, where you can explain the archetype in terms of hormones. You can also explain the archetype in terms of as an archetype. That's what I meant to say. As an internal mental psychic predisposition. Both explain the same phenomenon. They're just kind of different perspectives or different ways of explaining the exact same thing. They're not contradictory to each other. They're just sort of pieces of the puzzle. And I think that's why we have to treat psychology, that each psychological theory is kind of a piece in the puzzle, or potentially it's trying to explain the exact same thing. It's just using different metaphors, different analogies. And so it's not like one theory is wrong and the other is right. It's more like each theory has its place, and no theory is perfectly correct, but each of them is like a piece of the puzzle. One thing I wanted to mention, and I don't know how to fit this in, was I also want to talk a bit about Freud and whether his ideas are right or wrong. Again, Freud developed his ideas in a very similar way to Jung, but we could also say that Freud was a bit more dogmatic. He was a bit more persistent that his ideas were right, and he was kind of unwavering and unwilling to accept that he could be wrong. Whereas Jung believed that he was wrong very often. he would constantly criticize his own ideas in order to develop them into the best possible explanations. But Freud wasn't like that at all. He was very, in a sense, egoistic. But what about his ideas? Do his ideas make sense? Well, a lot of people just pretty much dismiss Freud for the exact reasons that they dismiss Jung, that it was an unscientific approach, that it was unfalsifiable, But what we find is that many of Freud's ideas, at least the core tenets of his psychology, do make sense. They're almost axiomatic. And a lot of experiments prove that, for example, that the motivation to pleasure is a very strong tendency in the human psyche. And that unconscious predisposition does influence behavior. So these things have been proven. It's just that many of his so those are like his core ideas that are generally true. They're not completely true. They're not the full picture. Let's say Freud believed that his theory was like all of human psychology. That there was nothing more than his theory, and that you can explain all sort of phenomena and all pathological developments as through a Freudian lens, which was not just plain not true. His theory was right, but only to a certain degree. And also some of his sort of fringe theories that were offshoots of his main theory, for example, like his idea of penis envy, proven definitely not true. Like there is nothing like that occurs in women. At least not regularly, or not with such as not as broadly as Freud believed it. And so again, we don't. Some of Freud's ideas can be discredited, as well as some of Jung's ideas can be discredited, just because modern evidence has shown that they aren't right. But again, I think some of the unfalsifiable ideas that Jung has about the psyche, about its structure, they're more difficult to prove. But that doesn't make them useless. In fact, it makes them very. I mean, the way he studied the psyche makes his insights quite valuable, I think. And it's a very unique perspective, and it's a very useful perspective that we don't get today. We don't get a very rigorous study of the psyche the way Jung studied it. We often get just very rudimentary psychological facts, like, did you know that people are, they prefer advertisements if there are bold colors, things like that are interesting, sure, but not very practical, especially when so many of us are plagued by psychological difficulties. I'll just look through my notes here and see if there's anything else worth talking about. And again, Jung is by no means infallible. Definitely not. He made mistakes. He admitted that he made mistakes. And it's up to us to sort of sort through his collected works and determine what is true and what is false. Again, a lot of things are just hard to study. It's hard to know whether it's true or false. We shouldn't just take it on fact, though. We can kind of accept it as a general truth, but it may not be applicable to all situations. And yeah, I think I'm just gonna leave it there. Hopefully that discussion will help clarify to what extent we can trust Carl Jung's ideas. I'd say we can trust them fairly well, but of course we have to have these indicia where we don't take everything as absolute truth. We accept that his way of explaining the psyche is very particular to him. I find it very useful, like I said, for discussing mythology, as well as giving a very general psychological description of the human mind. What I always think is that Jung is like a very good baseline psychology. It's a very good like general psychology. And then like more recent developments are like more specialized branches. But I'd say his psychology is very general and very true to a general degree. Obviously, certain pathological cases don't apply. Yeah, so hopefully you found this discussion useful. I'll see if I can. I'll see if I can try to. Like I said in the last one, I said I wanted to make a discussion page or something. I'll see if I can get around to that as soon as I can. But hopefully, if you stayed for this long, thanks for listening. Hopefully you didn't find that too boring. And take care.